All right, welcome to Whiskey and Words episode 2. Before we get started, I want to thank Toothgrinder for allowing me to use their music in my intro video. If you like it, you should definitely check them out. They're a metal band out of New Jersey. I got to see them live last summer. They were really good, and I'll put some links to their stuff in the description. But long story short, any band that references Carl Jung and their work is certainly fitting for what I'm trying to do with this show, so I like having them. Also, Tim, thanks again for being on. It's been difficult getting this thing rolling, so I appreciate your patience and flexibility.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thanks also for introducing me to a scotch that I like. It's the first one of a handful. It's a 21-year Glenfiddich, and it's quite good. So if you haven't tried it, give that one a try.
Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. Cheers.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. All right, so we're here to talk about population control, limiting factors, and Thanos. So we'll start with some basic fundamental stuff to get the ball rolling. We'll talk about human population, which has grown from about 1.5 billion to 6.1 billion-ish over a 100-year period. And that hasn't been a linear growth, that's been exponential. And that type of growth is not sustainable based on conditions on Earth, obviously. Luckily, researchers in the field predict that we will adopt what they call a logistical growth curve, and that'll show us our growth tapering off as we approach the Earth's carrying capacity, which could be around 10 billion, some estimate. Limiting factors are exactly what they sound like. They are factors that limit the growth of a population. So for most populations, basic obvious ones are food, predators, disease, and physical space. And as far as the human population goes, what all those things have in common is that we've basically overcome them. So food is not really a concern for us. It's obviously a finite resource based on what the Earth can produce, but we're far from reaching a limit on that, and we certainly overproduce in many cases, and arguably we eat things that shouldn't even be classified as food. So on the food front, we're doing pretty good. Predators aren't really a concern anymore due to the evolution of human beings, particularly in the brain area, development of tools and weapons, and we've placed ourselves, deservingly or not, at the top of the food chain. So that's not a concern so much. Disease, still a thing we battle pretty regularly. As the population's grown, we've seen a rise in rates of cancer and things like that. But even though as individuals we're pretty fragile, as an entire population we're pretty robust, and we are able to overcome disease for the most part. Although somebody hears a celebrity say that vaccinations gave their kid autism, and now we've got diseases making a comeback, which is also unfortunate. And then physical space we'll talk about a little bit later. That one's hard to overcome, but I mean, if you look at a city 200 years ago, you'd think we only have this two-dimensional space that we can exist in, and now we can stack each other up really high, and space isn't a concern so much either. If you have any thoughts on those things.
Yeah, a lot of topics to kind of cover and define there to start off. Let's talk first of all about the exponential growth rate of the populace. And it's important to define what the exponential growth rate actually is. And when you look at statistics, an exponential growth curve is anything in which the equation contains an exponent. Doesn't necessarily matter what that exponent is, but it does change the shape of the graph. So what most people think of when they think of exponential growth is a steep curve that gets steeper and steeper the further you get in time or along your x-axis. But that's not the only curve. That's only curves where your exponent is greater than 1. If your exponent is less than 1 but still greater than 0, you're actually going to reach some kind of plateau, and the magnitude of that value determines how quickly you get to that plateau. And then you can have decay curves, which are still exponential growth curves. They just go the other way. If the exponent is negative, you have a graph in which the values get lower and lower and reach some stable value. So when it comes to population, and not just the population of the Earth, but any population in a control zone, you have these limiting factors like you talk about, and they form what's called a logistical growth curve, where the graph actually takes on two different shapes. Initially, that shape is what most people think of when they think of an exponential growth curve, where the curve is getting steeper and steeper. But then once the exponent reaches a magnitude defined by the carrying capacity, which I'll define in a second, the graph actually changes shape. So the carrying capacity of any area is, like you said, defined by the limiting factors of that area. So for things like the population of the Earth, we don't necessarily know what that is, but we can conduct studies and make reasonable guesses. But as you approach the halfway point of that carrying capacity, your exponent takes such a value that you have a steep curve in your rate. Once you go past the halfway point of the carrying capacity function, that curve changes shape and starts to plateau out. It starts to take that shape of exponents that are less than 1 but still greater than 0. So when you combine those two shapes, you kind of make this S pattern shaped curve, and which kind of makes sense, right? As you approach the carrying capacity of a particular area, you're going to slow down your growth rate until you reach that plateau, which is going to be your carrying capacity. But it's very difficult to define what that carrying capacity is specifically for human beings on planet Earth. We can study lots of different types of populations, animal populations or bacteria populations under a microscope, and we can define what that carrying capacity is. But when you're talking about something as large as the Earth and a populace as large as human beings are, it's a little bit more difficult. So you mentioned a carrying capacity of 10 billion people, which is reasonable based on most of the studies. Most of them fall somewhere between 10 to 12 billion. But the range on all these studies is much larger. It's anywhere between 4 to 16 billion. So you have a large variance in the results of these studies. And in some of them, we've already surpassed the carrying capacity. Which doesn't bode well for future existence on the Earth. And in some of them, we're never going to make it to that carrying capacity based on current projections. But for the most part, the estimates come in with a 10 to 12 billion population carrying capacity for humans on planet Earth, which is right about where we're expected to top out at. Other topics that I think we covered about all of that you had suggested there for your intro.
Yeah, I think it's tough to pin down what the carrying capacity is because there are so many variables that go into it, and when we're talking about overcoming certain limiting factors, it's hard to predict how we're going to interact in the future. So whether it be physical space on Earth or resources the Earth is capable of providing, it gives you a huge range of numbers, so it's hard to pin down. Part of what I want to talk about is some more out-of-the-box type ideas as far as limiting factors go. And the reason that I thought of it, last year, probably around this time, there was a string of tragedies that happened, we'll call them, and one or two of them were school shootings. And, of course, the natural instinct is to get sucked into the political debate of gun control, and what gets left behind is a more important discussion about mental health. And so that's where my mind went, but not so much in the political realm of things, but more about what could possibly be causing these mental health issues. And there are a lot of people in the field studying these things, but one thought that came to mind was, is it possible that human beings have gotten so good at overcoming the limiting factors that we see in other populations that nature is stepping in and throwing other things at us that maybe we can't handle quite so easily? And so perhaps the mental health issues that cause a person to want to take their own life or take other people's lives and think that they don't have any other options, but that could be a way of nature kind of keeping us in check.
It's an interesting theory. I 100% agree with you. There is definitely a mental health issue to discuss when it comes to mass shootings, specifically in the realm of school shootings. These are things that hit us very close to home because of, our family background. We both have small children that are going to be, in the next few years entering the public school system. And so, it's something that's on my mind a lot, and I'm sure it's on your mind too. But it is important to stick to the facts with these particular issues, and not to get too political, but guns don't kill anybody. It's people that kill people, and we've been killing each other for as long as history has been written with different tools and instruments available to us. So whether it's a recent rise in mental health issues, or if it's just the latest string in a series of different tools that are being used to exact mortality on fellow human beings, I think I would lean towards the latter. Particularly if you want to get back to your original hypothesis, which is that the universe is somehow trying to self-correct. Personally, I see no evidence of a universal consciousness. Some people claim that they do, but for me personally, I have not seen evidence of that. But we're also specifically talking about mass shootings or school shootings or murder rates in the United States, which when you look at the population density with compared to Asian countries, specifically China or India, the most densely populated countries in the world, we're not talking about the mass shootings that are occurring in those areas. And if the universe were trying to, mystically self-correct an overpopulation issue, you would see, I would think, those areas being heavily targeted, and not necessarily, the United States or not necessarily Europe, for those types of events.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not so much the acts of violence, we'll call them, themselves that I think are the factor. It's just the mental health issues behind them. It's hard to find numbers on that kind of thing, but one statistic that I did find was that since 1981, disability payouts for major depressive disorders have tripled, which is pretty substantial. It's possible that some of those numbers are affected by other factors, like our ability to diagnose things like that has gotten better, certainly over that amount of time. So it's possible that plenty of people had those issues before, but we didn't know how to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the reasons why there's more children being diagnosed on the autism spectrum, because 30 years ago the autism spectrum was this big, whereas now we define it as something much larger.
Right.
And that same principle applies to multiple areas in the mental health realm.
Yeah, for sure. One of the other things that came to mind, which is equally controversial, equally political in nature, if you try to make it that way, is sexual preference. And that's another thing that's difficult to come up with numbers for, but a source that I found claimed that polls that they conducted showed that among adults, about a 6% rise in adults who identify as something other than heterosexual has occurred since 2012. And again, it's maybe a little bit of a reach, but human beings acting in a sexual manner for reasons other than procreation and choosing not to procreate is certainly a factor that affects population growth. So whether it be large or small, that's another thing. That is it possible that nature is causing these things in order to slow us down a little bit?
There's a couple of different factors that come into play there. One being the people who are likely to respond to those types of surveys. And 30 years ago, it was much more controversial to respond favorably to
Right.
those surveys than it is in today's climate. Another issue with the survey problem is the fact that homosexual couples in nature specifically, I can refer to studies in nature where homosexual couples have been shown to raise offspring, particularly of abandoned fawns or chicks. So they're raising the future generation of that population. And if we're proceeding under the assumption that the universe has some kind of base level consciousness and it's trying to self-correct, then not only would the rise in homosexual couples be shown, but it would also be shown that they wouldn't be raising the next generation. But we see, in fact, the opposite. We see in these communities, specifically amongst emperor penguins, you do see examples of homosexual couples that raise chicks of either abandoned or orphaned, baby penguins. And you see that in human society as well. That if a homosexual couple wants to raise a family and wants to have children, that's the way that they do it. They adopt, clearly. So, again, proceeding under the assumption that there's a universal consciousness, I don't know that necessarily follows that the rise in homosexuality is a limiting factor. I think it's more likely that it's more socially acceptable to proclaim that as your sexual preference today than it was, say, 30 years ago.
Right. Yeah, that thing about the penguins is pretty interesting. I didn't know that. Something else that makes you think. I recently rewatched. I've seen it several times. The classic documentary Idiocracy, and in the beginning of that,
that wasn't meant to be a documentary.
But it was pretty spot on. We're not going political on this one. It's pretty accurate though. But early in the movie, they talk about people who choose to reproduce versus people who don't, and it's got an example of a seemingly wealthy and intelligent couple deciding that it's not the right time to have children, and they keep putting it off. Meanwhile, Bubba, who rides motorcycles and whatever, is procreating like crazy.
Yeah, the family tree scene.
Right, yeah.
Right, where the redneck's family tree is massive and large-based, and the well-to-do family is like a straight line.
Yeah, as you said, it's a work of fiction, but it's certainly something to be concerned about, and you can see examples of that in society today. So,
well, yes and no. I certainly know plenty of families who, that are not any more or less intelligent than you or I, choose to have large families. 7, 8, 9 children, and it's mostly based on religious preference. There's no birth control allowed per their religious beliefs, and so they birth large families. I think what's more likely is that the social programs that exist specifically in our country do indirectly promote irresponsibility among classes of citizens that are trying to feed off of that system. You see that with large tax breaks. You see that with welfare programs, which were truthfully instituted to try to take care of families who couldn't afford those large families that they already had. But it is turned into a system that you can exploit, and our policymakers in this country aren't doing us any favors with respect to that. But what I can say I've experienced as a limiting factor, if you will, among people who do plan out their lives and their family size has been the influence of climate change and the recent studies and the coming to light more information that we have on climate change and the size of their family, or whether to have a family or not at all. I got into a discussion with a young woman on social media about a month ago where she claimed that because of the issue with climate change facing, not just us in the United States, but us in the world, she was adamant that it was not the right time for her to bring children into the world, and it may never be, based on the projections that we see of the amount of time it's going to take for us to turn climate change, to put the policies in place to actually be able to curb this thing. So, more so than necessarily intelligence level is looking at these issues that are plaguing us as a society today. And I don't think that it's necessarily specific to our generation either. I feel like every generation has had their argument against having children. This one just seems to be more pervasive on a worldwide level. We've seen instances with missiles off the coast of the United States, in Cuba. We've been through world wars. I feel like every generation has had the excuse, not necessarily the excuse, but the claim that how can I bring a child into the world in these current geopolitical climates. But I do feel like this generation in particular has probably the most universal claim to that statement,
right?
Being that the climate change effects that we're going to see here are the same that are going to happen on the other side of the world. So it was a very interesting conversation. It wasn't a perspective that I had heard before, and I asked some pretty probing questions, and the conversation got very emotional very quickly, clearly because of what's at stake.
Right.
But it was just interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have. I think it makes you think a little bit, because if you're thoughtful enough to consider what the future holds for a child you might bring into the world, then you might also be thoughtful enough to raise that child in such a way that they're able to help the problem instead of contribute to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe help make the world a better place for their own generation.
Yeah.
So another point you brought up that's pretty interesting is government stepping in, and as you said, the various programs that are out there that have kind of had the negative effect of promoting reckless procreation, we'll say, were not intended for that purpose. They were just intended to help people who didn't have the means to help themselves, and obviously good-natured. Similarly, going back to the topic of population control, in places like China, where they institute a one child per family policy, you've certainly seen some pretty negative effects as far as families having their one child and hoping for a son to carry on the family name, but getting a daughter instead. There have been some pretty horrific stories about what happens after that. So
yeah, there absolutely has been. Nevertheless, what we've seen with the population in China has been that, like we described earlier, the logistical growth curve. We're seeing that start to take place, where the births per household have gotten below 2, which is as it turns out, the ratio that you need for a exponent of 1, right? With a mother and a father and 2 children, that exponent is 1, right, which is a straight growth curve. As opposed to what we've seen in India, which is India is actually catching up to China at this point, and by the year 2050, they're expected to overtake them. Whereas in India, you see the policies there, you see the government trying to influence the decision making of the people instead of making a blanket rule. You will only have 1 child per household. Now, I'm not trying to advocate for the overreach of government, stepping into private citizens' lives. But the fact of the matter is that sometime in the 70s, China instituted this policy, and here we are, 40 years later, and it seems to have worked, at least to the point where someone else is catching up and is expected to overtake them. Whereas, the policies of influencing people's decision making doesn't seem to be doing the job, at least in India. You're looking at, China still has a larger population than India does, but both of them are right around 1.3 billion at this point. And with the growth rates of each of them, by 2050, India will overtake China unless they do something in the next 20 years.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I'm never in favor of the government stepping in and telling you how to live your life, but certainly something needs to be done before we reach a carrying capacity and we have decisions forced upon us in order to survive, as opposed to being able to make responsible decisions now.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads into the next point that everybody's probably watching for is the Thanos concept. So a little bit of background on the character Thanos, who is fictional, by the way, and to lead off,
we hope.
Yeah, that's true. I don't promote killing off half of any population, and I feel like I need to say that because
that's good.
It's 2019, and anything you say on social media like, "Hey, Hitler had good taste in mustaches," then automatically I'm a Nazi. So I'm not a Thanos supporter. I'm just playing devil's advocate here for the sake of conversation.
But Charlie Chaplin had a fantastic mustache.
That is true. It was a pretty similar mustache. I don't know if everybody would agree, though.
It was fantastic.
Back to Thanos. He grew up on a planet called Titan, and at some point he realized that the population on that planet was growing at a rate that was not sustainable, and while nobody else was really doing anything about it, he brought up to his government that there were solutions that they could try, and one of those was killing off half of the population so that the remaining half could prosper, which sounds pretty terrible, because it is. And sorry for the spoilers if you haven't seen the movie, but at this point, I don't know why you haven't seen the movie. You should go see it. It's very good. Avengers Infinity War. His approach, he expands to the entire universe, and in obtaining the Infinity Gauntlet and the stones that go in it, he, with the snap of a finger, can make half of all life in the universe disappear for the same purpose, to stop excessive overgrowth of population and to make it so that the remaining population can prosper and live happily. So that's his goal throughout the movie. He's obviously the villain of the movie, and the Avengers try to stop him. But he certainly has raised some points that are worth talking about. Again, it's a pretty terrible and devastating approach that he takes to solving a problem, but nature has shown to provide similar terrible and devastating answers to problems like that. For example, forest fires. If you take a look at what happens, certainly across the United States at least, it's such an integral part of a forest ecosystem for a fire to come through and wipe out old overgrowth and leave room for new growth, that certain trees only grow seeds in pine cones that are sealed until they reach such a high temperature as occurs in a forest fire. So a pretty devastating thing a forest fire can be, but it's necessary and useful to the environment. So I only bring that up to say that nature can be nasty, just like Thanos was. There's an easy argument to have as to whether he was right or wrong, but another argument that I'd like to talk about is it possible, as I was saying about other things, that he is simply a force of nature working to correct itself?
Again, another interesting perspective. One differentiating point has to be, though, that whereas with acts of nature, be they earthquakes or floods or forest fires, those things don't have conscience or sentience. Whereas the character Thanos in this case was created by, Stan Lee, I would assume, as a being with conscience and at least some sense of morality, whatever that happened to be. He had the ability to make decisions on his own, whereas a forest fire is going to bend to the whims of the rest of the environment, whether it's winds or landscape, topography. So it is an important distinction to make, that the why behind the action, and if there even is a why, does need to be discussed. In fact, I think it's more appropriate to describe his actions as the actions of a predator. An example of that would be deer population, right? The local governments in areas that have overpopulations of deer will issue more permits to hunters during hunting season to try to cull the deer herd in a particular area. And if another area adjacent to it doesn't have as much deer, there'll be less permits issued in that area. And that's pretty much the same thing with all hunting seasons. It's based on the local government's estimate of population in the area, and what that population growth looks like over the next few years. So it's a predatorial approach as opposed to an active nature, and that's what we see here. Thanos, as judge, jury, and executioner, has said, "I need to cull the herd by 50%," and he does so. Again, it kind of gets back to your earlier point about universal consciousness, which, again, I say I have no evidence of. And because I have no evidence of that, I have to say that his actions are more the actions of a predator and not necessarily that of nature.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because we as human beings tend to think of ourselves as pretty important. So we can talk about things that we do that are predatorial in nature, like you said, issuing more or less permits for deer hunting as a way to control that population. But if somebody does the same thing to us, it's significantly more horrific in our minds. Granted, hunting of deer largely is used for resources, for food. So if Thanos was killing off half of us and eating us, maybe it would be a little bit of a different story. But it's interesting to bring up the point of us working to control populations of other creatures by killing them, compared to some other creature controlling our population by killing us.
It's the realization of the top of the food chain that you've been replaced.
Yeah.
Which obviously in humanity's history has never happened, but that's not to say that it never will happen in humanity's history.
Yeah, certainly. As bad as it is, there's, I don't know, an argument to be made as to whether he was right or wrong. One issue that I have with his approach is that they don't make a distinction between different forms of life, and in just our ecosystem, most life is a resource for other life. So if you're killing off half of all life, you're killing off resources. If you kill off half of all the cows, that's half the hamburgers that I can eat. So
well, that's true, but not only that, the half of all life, and it was described in the movie. I don't know if it was described in the comics books this way or not, but at least in the movie, it was described as a 50-50 chance. It would be completely random, and in Thanos' opinion, it would be fair. Which, if his goal is to limit the population and thereby ensure the continued existence of that population, there's a better method of doing that than 50-50. In a 50-50 scenario, there is a non-zero probability that you're going to wipe out half, the upper half of productive members of society, leaving the lower half, or the dredges of society, if you will, which is not conducive to fostering further growth of that civilization, or ensuring its continued survival. There's also a scenario where you have now killed off all the doctors and left all the lawyers and politicians around for the rest of us, which obviously would be a devastating result for the rest of humanity. So a 50-50 shot, while I disagree with the concept of judge, jury, and executioner on Thanos' part, if it were shown that that was the only way that we were going to, ensure humanity's continued existence, there surely must be a better way than 50-50. And on that note, this guy, so he gains the 6 stones, right, that were birthed at the birth of the universe, right? And so he has the power of creation in his hand, according to the movie. Why not just spawn more resources or more planets, or, why kill half the population? Why was that deemed necessary? Which is really the crux of the issue, and why I think it was necessary. It was the obligation of the heroes of the story to try to stop that act.
You brought up a couple of good points there. To talk about the origin of Thanos in the comic books, I don't really recall if it was so much of a 50-50 split in the comics, but one big difference is the reason for him doing those things. In the comic books, it was all for a woman, as things usually tend to be in our society also.
The best reason to do something.
But that's not as good for a conversation like this. So luckily they adapted his motives in the movie to be a more political and cultural type of a reason, and so now we can talk about it. Another thing that you mentioned was the 50-50. I think you're absolutely right that if you have to eliminate half of a population, you could certainly be a little bit more efficient than a random 50-50, but in the way he references in the movie is that makes it fair and merciful. Certainly by eliminating prejudice and targeting, you can call it fair. But yeah, it certainly is a possibility that you leave us worse off than we started. Having less people, but a higher ratio of shitty people to good people.
And you can quantify it. There's exactly a 50% chance that you are going to leave it worse off than it was before. Right. In terms of the productivity of the inhabitants, anyway.
The other good point you brought up was why couldn't he just snap and create twice as many resources as opposed to half as many people? Mm-hmm. And I've heard that argument made a lot, but if you're talking about the concept of morality and responsibility, you have to think at least a little bit. If you have a population like human beings, for example, who, number one, so far have grown wildly out of control without much regard for the resources or the space that they take up and what the limits of those things are, but also the effect that we have on our environment, like you mentioned earlier, global warming and things like that. We don't tend to make the responsible choices as far as the use of our resources or our space. And do we deserve to be given infinite resources to continue to do the same things and make the same bad choices that we have to this point.
Well, the choices have to be based around the facts, right? And the facts is that this generation is seeing the effects of decisions that have been made generations in the past. These generations didn't have the information that we have today. They, 100 years ago, if you'd have told them that, we were going to be at 7.5 billion people, 7.6 billion people in the world today, they probably would have balked at that number. They also would have balked at the impact to the earth that is being shown to have. So in light of the fact that these studies are coming out, the estimates on carrying capacity and the logistical growth rate, we're able to make better decisions today than we were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So tying that back into the original point, yeah, I think we are doing a better job of making decisions that are going to be influencing future generations today because we have better information today, not because we're, better or worse people than 100 years ago or 200 years ago, but we have more information and we have better ways of making decisions than people had 100 years ago. So to say that we don't deserve more resources, what is that based on? Is that based on the fact of the decisions that we're making now, or is that based on decisions that were made 100 years ago that I have no control over? All I can do is take the facts that I have today and make decisions on them today to influence change at a later date.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's tough to tell because, we can't see into the future. So now is as far ahead as we've gotten. And certainly we can see differences between the way we act now and the way we acted 100 years ago. But just observing human behavior makes you wonder. I feel like given the choice between acting responsibly with what we have or, the prospect of colonizing other planets, for example, people will tend to take that as an out rather than making responsible choices because the earth becomes less important as far as preserving its resources go if you have other opportunities elsewhere.
Well, the earth is always going to be important, even if we go and colonize Mars or any of the other celestial bodies in our solar system. The earth is always going to be important because it's going to be the source of innovation for the technologies that develop those areas. It's going to be the source of the resources that are sent to initially, provide sustenance for those areas. If you talk about colonizing Mars, if we're ever going to colonize Mars, we have to first supply it with resources from Earth. So you're essentially extending the Earth's responsibility with respect to what it has to supply and with what it has to maintain. And part of the effort to colonize Mars is going to come a technology that allows for the growth of agriculture and of resources on that planet. It has to, otherwise Earth will continue to be drained of resources to support that colony. And those technologies are going to be tested here. They're going to be developed here. They're going to be tested here first. They're not going to be developed on Mars and tested on Mars. It'll be done here. And the way that you're going to do that is by trying to develop them and test the technologies in places where we deem agriculture to be irrelevant or not hospitable to growth of resources or otherwise. You think of areas like the Gobi or the Sahara, these places that are completely devoid of plant life or the ability to raise agriculture to change that landscape. But those are the places that the technologies are going to have to be tested because that's the kind of environment that they're going to be exposed to on a place like Mars. Not necessarily the temperatures of the Sahara, but certainly the barrenness and the inhospitable soil composition. And in doing so, why I bring that up, in doing so, you're automatically going to increase the carrying capacity of the earth. One of the limiting factors you talked about was the ability to, produce more agriculture. Well, if you're able to develop the technologies that produce agriculture in a place as inhospitable as Mars, you're going to figure out how to do that here, and you're going to turn places that were previously not considered agriculturally viable as now being viable. So that 10 to 12 billion people now starts to extend, and now you've built yourself more margin. But now we have the information. We have the information to say, this is more than likely what our carrying capacity is. We need to maintain margin to that carrying capacity. And I think that instead of seeing reckless decisions made, I think that we would see more informed decisions made at that point.
Yeah, I hope you're right, man. That's we've certainly seen innovation in that direction, which is good. But at the same time, to be the pessimist, you see resistance to things like nuclear power when we've been doing it for 60, 70 years successfully, minus a couple of places where mistakes were made. But again, we have so much more information and experience now than we did then. I mean, the Navy operates nuclear reactors on harsh seas with no issues, but people are still hesitant to accept that as a green technology, so much so that when a bill is released called the Green New Deal, it's not even included in there as a green energy. It's pretty crazy. So I hope that in the future you're right about the decisions people make and their acceptance of these technologies that are coming that are going to help us to overcome issues like that.
Again, we need to expand our thinking a little bit beyond our own borders, right? While nuclear seems to be dwindling in the United States, it's thriving in a lot of other places. The Middle East, for example, is rapidly building nuclear technologies. China is investing heavily in nuclear power. So much so that they're funding American companies for research and development. So yes, while we see the borders of the United States being opposed to nuclear as a general rule, we are seeing that expand in areas, some of them that have never seen nuclear power before, like the Middle East. France, for example, is some 70% powered by nuclear, and it has been for years. So I feel like as a whole, when you consider the Earth and all the countries that comprise the Earth as a whole, we are still seeing nuclear being treated as a green energy and its viability to power grids in places. It's just unfortunate to see that happening in the U.S.
Yeah, I think hopefully we'll come around. It's certainly a big part of the future if you want to preserve the climate. You can't really deny that at this point, but it can be scary because people only know what they see in the news, and the news makes a business on negative. So, but to branch off into another conversation that'll have to do with the next couple of episodes that I want to do. As I said before, human beings tend to look at themselves as more important than a lot of other life forms in the world. But if you think about just the concept of consciousness, which we don't really understand at all at this point, but you can't narrow down consciousness to just us. And if we gain some further understanding of consciousness to the point where we need physical human bodies less than we do now, whether it be because we figure out how to upload consciousness to a digital space or because we just transcend the physical matter state of what we see as the real world and and move beyond that. Another possibility is that the carrying capacity of Earth becomes less important, or at least less impactful, when we take up less physical space and less physical resources as a result of that.
Sure, the technology is out there, the studies are out there that show, likely by the end of your and my lifetime, people's thought patterns, brain waves, consciousness, if you will, is going to be able to be uploaded into machines, into computers or cyberspace, if you will. So it's coming. It's projected to happen. That first transition step obviously isn't going to, completely eliminate Homo sapiens as a species.
Right.
Right. In fact, what it likely would be used for first would be prolonging the thoughts and memories of, relatives, grandparents, great-grandparents, and not necessarily seen for many years as a transition of our species into its next phase of evolution. And what would that even look like if humans are no longer part of the world as we know it? They're now uploaded into a digital sphere. How do you reproduce? How do you, what kind of resources do you need? Something still has to be able to preserve the network that makes up your digital reality now. So something has to exist outside of that digital space in order to preserve that realm, which is going to need resources. So it's almost like a class split at that point, where the upper class has the ability to transition into that kind of space, and the lower classes are stuck outside of it, tending the data farms and whatnot, if you will. So even though it is possible for that to happen, I don't know what the impact on being able to upload consciousness to a digital device is going to do in terms of carrying capacity.
Well, the next couple episodes that I want to do, I think you'll be interested in, and conveniently, this whole conversation kind of plays into that like a stepping stone. So it's built up quite nicely. I'm doing episode 3 in 3 parts, and the main part is going to be largely about the universe as one conscious organism, and we've kind of talked about that a little bit. Certainly you and I are on different ends of that argument, but part A is going to be called There Are No Facts, which is more of a thought experiment and a leap to kind of get people thinking out of the box, and so they can go down this rabbit hole of a conversation with me. But I think
it's definitely a leap.
Yeah, I think
the statement in and of itself is an oxymoron because if you make the statement there are no facts and you're right, that is a fact, and your statement is false.
That's true. It's certainly more of a conversation about how little we know about ourselves and the world around us than facts themselves, but I figured it's a title that'll get people's attention, certainly people like you, and hopefully I'll see you in the comments of that one.
Yeah, love to be involved in any discussion along those lines.
To recap, I think we've decided unanimously that Thanos was wrong.
Absolutely, and unequivocally, yes, he was wrong.
All right, I agree with that statement. Yeah, I think we can call it good on that.
All
Thank
right.
you again for coming on. I appreciate
absolutely.
it.
It was a fun time. I appreciate you having me on.
And until next time, remember, always aim for the head.